"Kill her!" A chilling whisper resonated just as the steel door of the gym slammed shut. 4 hulking police officers surrounded the only black woman in the room, their arrogant smiles fading, replaced by the bloodthirsty gazes of predators. Training, they called it. But the click of the deadbolt and the crippling blows exposed a meticulously hidden, heinous plot. But the moment the commander lunged for the finishing blow, he didn't realize he'd just struck a steel fortress. The woman didn't fall. Instead, she instantly countered, yelling a death sentence for their careers. Assaulting a federal agent. Everything is being recorded. Her true identity plunged the room into a stunned silence. From a vile lesson in the shadows, the incident exploded into a storm that swept away an entire corrupt police department. Even the power of his high-ranking lawyer mother couldn't conceal that fateful recording. Irrefutable evidence that dragged the racist Alpha from his position straight into a prison cell with a 35-year sentence. Can the badge of law enforcement forever be a shield for crime? Or does true justice only arrive when the victim dares to stand alone and fight among wolves? If your daughter was cornered by 4 men in a closed room just because of her skin color, what would you do? Leave a comment and watch to the end of the video to witness the steep price the perpetrators paid. The Internal Security Bureau's Friday night briefing room was draftless and colder than usual, as if even the walls were bracing themselves for bad news. Old framed photographs of once celebrated units hung along the wall. One of them bore the inscription, "Maple Ridge, Exemplary Unit of the State." The gold lettering on the commendation plaque still gleamed, but the wooden frame had faded and frayed at the edges, like a mask worn down by time, until the truth beneath began to show. The image carried an uneasy feeling, difficult to explain, as though excessive polish was often used to hide something fundamentally wrong. Hale stepped into the room, carrying a stack of files nearly as wide as his forearm. The wooden table let out a heavy thud when the files landed. 52 complaints, he said, his eyes scanning each face around the table, all anonymous, and all describing the same type of behavior. His voice was not loud, but the weight of the information drew the room to sharp attention. No one wanted to hear about an investigation into a commendation-winning unit, but the numbers in front of them allowed no room for avoidance. A young agent opened his tablet, swiping quickly through the newly encrypted complaint list. Called derogatory names. He paused briefly, then continued reading. Subjected to force outside approved protocol. Reports altered or lost. No one reacted immediately, but the air felt as though its oxygen had thinned. None of these descriptions was unheard of, yet their concentrated presence within a single unit had pushed past the threshold of alarm. Hale played a hallway camera video from Maple Ridge. The footage was blurry and grainy due to the obstructed angle, but it still showed a young officer being shoved hard into a wall, his back striking an electrical box that left him staggering. A short, mocking laugh echoed from behind, but the camera captured no identifiable faces. No one admitted anything. No one claimed to be present, Hale said, eyes fixed on the screen. The young officer transferred out 3 months later and refused all contact. The timestamp at the end of the footage sent a chill down the spine, as though Maple Ridge had grown too accustomed to erasing traces. A female agent leaned back in her chair, expression hardening. Anyone from their internal team cooperating? The question had barely left her mouth before Hale shook his head. No, complete silence. Not the kind that comes from fear of trouble, organized silence. The room thickened again, as though Maple Ridge's silence had seeped in through the files. The team leader placed both hands on the table, surveying everyone before speaking. If Maple Ridge is rotten at its root, we can't dig from the outside. We need someone on the inside. The decision wasn't surprising, but it tightened the atmosphere another notch. Embedding an operative within a police unit suspected of violent culture was the kind of assignment that easily turned disastrous not only for the agent, but for the entire investigation. Another agent tapped his pen lightly against the edge of the table. To pull the roots out of a pack, you need someone tough enough to stand right in front of the wolf's mouth. A few exchanged looks, equal parts concern and acknowledgement of the truth in the statement. Not everyone was willing to walk into a place where the rule breakers were the ones carrying guns and local authority. Hale didn't answer immediately. He opened a slim folder thinner than the complaint files, but marked with priority red. He set it at the center of the table, gently, but with finality. Avery Cole. The name made several brows lift. Handled 3 internal investigations successfully, and in all 3, she confronted the people actively trying to hide the truth. He paused, reading the note beneath her file photo. Survived an uneven close-quarters assignment. Hale's eyes darkened slightly at the memory of that report. And she has a reason not to walk away halfway. No one asked what that reason was. Some already knew. The rest understood that if Hale did not say it aloud, it was too personal for the record. But the fact that an agent continued to pursue internal cases, the kind most avoided due to their danger, already said enough. She was not someone who quit. The team leader scanned the room once more, as if ensuring no one intended to object. In that moment, the steady hum of the air conditioner and the faint ticking of the wall clock merged into a particular kind of silence. The silence of unspoken consensus. When the leader tapped the table, the sound was dry but resolute. Embed her in Maple Ridge. From this point on, we're not monitoring a unit, we're monitoring a disease. The decision rang out like the cocking of a firearm. And Maple Ridge, beneath its polished praise, had just become a battlefield in everyone's eyes. Tomorrow, Avery Cole would receive the call that would alter the entire trajectory of her life. The afternoon spilled a deep amber hue across the training facility, light pouring through the tall windows and stretching into long bands on the cold wooden floor. The room was nearly empty, holding only the dry, compact sound of Avery's fists striking the heavy bag. Each punch was steady, yet carried a weight difficult to measure. As if she were trying to drive away an old memory that had clung to her for years. Her face was focused to the point that the bag recoiled in clean, rhythmic swings, and in each clipped breath, there was something mixed, in part anger, part a buried vow no one else knew. The door opened, and Hale stepped in with the bearing of someone accustomed to bringing heavy news. He didn't speak right away, placing a folder on the table beside the heavy bag. The sound of paper hitting wood was soft, but loud enough for Avery to turn. He asked, "Want a difficult one?" His voice was calm, but Avery caught the intention beneath it. She drew a deep breath, letting her hand fall from the bag. "You've never offered me anything easy." The answer was steady, though the fire from her training session still flickered in her eyes. Avery opened the folder. Even from the first few pages, that familiar fracture deep inside her stirred. Lines describing the complaints were written in different voices, but carried the same core. Slurs used during duty, excessive force beyond training standards, reports that vanished, and cameras that failed at suspicious moments. She flipped a few more pages, her hand slowing when she reached the hallway footage from Maple Ridge. Blurry as it was, it still awakened a sense of helplessness she had once lived through. Old wounds she thought had settled quietly began to throb again. Hale stood nearby watching, his eyes following each subtle shift in her expression. He spoke. "You're not the only one they ever dismissed, Avery." The words weren't loud, but they slipped into the room like a thin blade. Avery paused for a moment, trying to keep her gaze steady, but the hardening in her face revealed how precisely the statement had struck. Part of her still remembered vividly the night the police said they could do nothing more, despite the evidence being undeniable. That indifference had pushed her onto this path, and Maple Ridge had just pressed against the same raw seam. She set her finger along the edge of the folder. Deep cover, huh? Her breath was even, but Hale heard the increased caution in her voice. He nodded. Your cover is a federal self-defense instructor. You observe, document, and avoid unnecessary confrontations. Avery narrowed her eyes slightly, then let out a thin smile. There's no rotten unit out there where you can avoid confrontation. Her tone was calm, but carried the quiet fatigue of someone who had seen this kind of place more than once. Hale stepped closer, pulling a small dark device from his pocket. He placed it in Avery's palm. It was cold, compact, and looked harmless, but beneath it lay the emergency communication line. Federal SOS. Use it when your life is truly in danger. Maple Ridge has a reputation. He didn't elaborate, but the caution in his eyes was enough for Avery to understand that the reputation was not a harmless rumor. They had likely monitored Maple Ridge from a distance before, without concrete proof. Avery turned the device between her fingers, feeling the sharpness of its metal edge. It reminded her of an old mentor's warning that the most ordinary-looking places often hid the greatest dangers. The flicker of hesitation in her eyes vanished quickly. She snapped the folder shut with a firm motion, slipped it into her bag, and pulled the zipper closed. When do I leave? Hale answered immediately. Tomorrow morning. You go alone. And Avery, don't stay isolated in there for too long. The last line made Avery pause. She turned to look at Hale, their eyes meeting in a brief, heavy silence. He wasn't offering a practical reminder. It was a warning that something inside Maple Ridge existed beyond what the files described. She understood not through paperwork, but through the same instinct that had once saved her life in a lopsided close-quarters assignment. Avery lifted the bag onto her shoulder, stepped past Hale, and headed toward the door. The hallway outside was long and bright, carrying the faint scent of floor wax through the air. Each footstep echoed softly, sounding like the quiet movement of someone preparing to walk into a battle no one could predict the outcome of. The unease inside her didn't shape itself into fear, but it didn't disappear either. What pulled her forward more strongly than any fear was the memory of the night the police abandoned her family at the exact moment they needed help most. At the doorway, Avery paused briefly, as if to steady the final breath of a long day. She pushed the door open and stepped through, leaving the training room behind with the heavy bag still swaying from her last strike. The hallway light rushed in, carrying the sense that this mission would not be easy. But Avery had never backed away from what others feared. As she disappeared past the doorway, Hale watched the space she left behind and murmured to himself, "Let's hope they haven't smelled blood yet." Morning in Maple Ridge lay under a thin veil of mist, yet the sunlight filtering through the front glass was still bright enough to reveal every streak of dust clinging to the aging sign. As Avery stepped up the concrete stairs, a light breeze carried the scent of metal mixed with rubber drifting from the training yard behind the building. The glass door opened with a thin hinge screech, an echo sharp enough to make several officers near the reception counter turn. Their conversation halted, and their eyes shifted toward her. No greeting, no friendliness. The first thing Avery felt was an invisible weight settling into the space before her. A faint voice floated from the cluster of officers. "That's her? The federal instructor." Another answered immediately. "Looks tiny." Laughter flicked through the air like a blade, brief but cutting, and it died the moment Avery's gaze slid toward them. She did not react, but their behavior told her Maple Ridge was already testing the limits of the newcomer. Under the cold white lights of the lobby, that scrutiny became her first welcome. Avery approached the reception desk, where an officer was scanning through a list. His face revealed a poorly masked surprise at the file that had been sent ahead. "You're from the FBI?" he asked, voice caught between doubt and polite restraint. Avery replied softly, "I'm here to instruct." Nothing more. The way she said it kept the exchange within its necessary boundaries. The receptionist nodded slowly, still appearing unconvinced that someone like her had been assigned here for what seemed to be a significant task. As she entered the main hallway, Avery felt the eyes behind her more clearly. Those standing near the vending machine, those leaning against filing cabinets, those passing through the lobby, each watched her with a mixture of concealment and insufficient subtlety. Suspicion blended with disdain, forming a faintly abrasive atmosphere. The polished floor reflected her steps, and the sound of her shoes seemed slightly louder than usual, making the hallway feel narrower. This place was clearly accustomed to seeing only familiar faces, and disliked the intrusion of anything new. An officer passed by, close enough for his remark to fall precisely between them. "This isn't a yoga studio." He said it without turning back, his voice just loud enough for Avery to hear. She kept walking, expression unchanged. A sharp heat moved through her chest, but was quickly suppressed by the disciplined calm she had built over the years in the field. Comments like that didn't surprise her, but the collective attitude she sensed suggested Maple Ridge had shaped itself into too tight a pack. Avery paused before a wall of commendations. Wooden frames hung in neat rows, most of them featuring white officers receiving awards. Ceiling lights cast down over a film of dust no one had bothered to wipe away, despite the display being placed in such a visible location. The fading photos, and the dust layering over them, made the wall resemble a forced, outdated aura of prestige, as if Maple Ridge were living off its reputation rather than any remaining integrity worth admiring. Avery studied the wall for a moment, feeling the same familiar tug she had felt on prior assignments. A reminder that the most praised places often required the closest watch. A figure appeared from the direction of the staircase, walking slowly enough to signal caution but not reluctance. "Avery Cole," the man said as he approached. "I'm Havers." He extended his hand. His handshake lacked strength, but carried hesitation. "Welcome." "I guess?" His tone tried for warmth, though his eyes briefly darted away. It was enough for Avery to understand he was not opposed to her being here, but he also couldn't risk showing any overt stance within this environment. Havers guided her down the hallway, pointing out various sections. Through the large glass window overlooking the training yard, several officers were working through physical drills. A laugh erupted from the far end, unmistakably from a large-built officer. "Looks like you boys are excited about the new instructor, huh?" His group echoed with amused snickers. The moment passed quickly, but left a dense residue in the air. Avery did not look back. She simply added it to the early set of signals shaping her assessment of this place. As they reached the corridor leading toward the meeting rooms, Avery sensed the underlying power structure operating beneath Maple Ridge's professional surface. Havers kept pace beside her. But the way he watched others, as though measuring every breath in the environment, told her he understood this place better than any orientation speech could convey. The voices and laughter echoing from distant corners all carried the tone of a unit, long accustomed to silence being the safest response. Avery inhaled lightly, steadying her awareness. She realized the reactions she had encountered were not truly about her. They were instinctive responses of an insular group protecting itself from outsiders. That didn't make the mission any less sharp-edged. Everything she had seen this morning confirmed Maple Ridge would be a genuine test. She knew she needed to remain as blank as paper before allowing herself any conclusions, because only then could she see the truth beneath the surface. As Avery and Havers stepped past the intersection where two hallways met, a man's voice rose from behind them, loud enough to cut through the sound of footsteps on the polished floor. "Who is she that the whole team suddenly freezes up?" His tone held both mockery and challenge, pulling everyone's attention behind Avery. No one answered him immediately, but the abrupt hush spread through the corridor like a spark catching dry tinder. heating the already tense air of Maple Ridge. The air behind Avery shifted in tone before she could turn around. Conversations scattered like pieces of paper caught in the wind, and the abrupt silence signaled the arrival of someone Maple Ridge regarded as its true center of power. When she faced the hallway, Lucas Ward had already stepped out from the dim corridor behind them. He was taller than most of the officers nearby, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the tiled floor, and his eyes were cold enough to feel like a blade that had already formed a conclusion about her before he even spoke. 3 steps were all it took to assert that this was his territory, and everyone here knew it. Ward stopped in front of Avery. He looked her over from head to toe, with not a trace of respect. Though his expression remained casual, he asked, "You're the one from the feds." His voice was low. Not a question, not a greeting, but a test of endurance. It was his way of telling Avery that Maple Ridge did not welcome outsiders with courtesy, but with psychological pressure. Avery held her ground, not stepping back even half an inch. "I'm here to instruct self-defense techniques." Ward gave a blunt nod. "Huh, doesn't look like someone who teaches us." Of son. Behind him, a few officers let out quiet snickers, laughter laced with disdain, the reflex of a group accustomed to leaning on power to assert itself. But as soon as Ward glanced over his shoulder, the laughter died instantly. Without needing a word, the cluster straightened as if afraid of crossing an invisible line he had drawn. Ward's influence required no shouting. It lived in his stare, and in the fear embedded throughout the unit. Avery recognized it immediately, and it made her mission all the more defined. Havers stepped forward, trying to pull the atmosphere back from the edge. "Ward, this is an order from above. I train my people. I don't need anyone holding our hands." His voice carried a thick challenge, and the remark served both as a blow, aimed at Avery, and a warning to everyone watching. The pack behind him remained silent, but their eyes reflected alignment, as though Ward's words were unwritten law. Everyone understood. He stepped closer to Avery half a stride, but enough for his breath to brush the air in front of her. "You gonna survive this? Maple Ridge doesn't play safe." His voice was smooth, low, and edged exactly the tone of someone who thrived on control and tested others by invading their space. He didn't need to say much. His presence alone was usually enough to make newcomers recoil. Avery did not recoil. She met his eyes, her gaze calm but sharp, like water undisturbed yet deep. "I didn't come here for safety." Her response was steady enough to make a few people behind him hold their breath, surprised anyone would confront Ward directly. Avery's composure was not loud, but it cut the room into 2 distinct currents. Ward narrowed his eyes slightly. Not startled, but intrigued. He had never met someone from outside who kept their stance so direct. Most tried to win him over, or at least avoided his gaze to sidestep attention. But Avery stood firm, showing no fear even as the tension around her thickened by the second. It made Ward reassess her in a way he rarely extended to outsiders. Behind him, several officers instinctively stepped back half a pace. Not to retreat, but to watch. Since Avery had stepped into the lobby, the pack had only laughed and postured. But this standoff shifted them into a new mode, like predators, pausing to see which of the 2 stronger figures would make the first decisive move. The room wasn't large, but it easily held the expanding tension between them. Havers watched from Avery's side, realizing the moment was spiraling beyond what he had intended. He tugged lightly at her sleeve, signaling that she should exit this needless clash before it escalated. But Avery didn't look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on Ward, not out of competitiveness, but because this was her first measure of the man who dominated the unit. Someone like Ward didn't strike first. He observed, probed, marked, and chose his timing. That made him far more dangerous than the pack behind him. Ward tilted his head slightly, the ceiling lights casting his shadow long across the polished floor. "All right. Let's see how tough you are," he spoke slowly, each word falling into just the right gap to keep the room frozen in place. He didn't raise his voice, yet everyone heard him clearly. It felt like a declaration of dominance, the leader of the pack, choosing a target to test. Avery stayed silent, still holding her position. She knew saying more would skew the dynamic, giving Ward room to twist her words into something that reset the power balance in his favor. Silence was the only move that didn't hand him anything. It wasn't retreat. It was the opening stance of a longer confrontation she knew was coming. Ward finally stepped back, half a pace, signaling the end of his initial test. As he turned away, the atmosphere in the room loosened slightly, as someone had just released a breath held for too long. But before he returned to his group, Ward tossed out one final line, loud enough for every ear in the hallway. "Let's see how long you last in this pack." Late morning sunlight spilled across the training field behind Maple Ridge, shining over the long red mats laid out in 2 rows. The air outside felt clearer than the hallways inside. Yet the tension Avery had sensed since entering the unit had not thinned at all. She stood at the center of the mat and signaled for the team to begin warm-ups. Some officers followed sluggishly, while others exchanged gleeful looks. One man spoke loudly enough for the entire group to hear, "Easy there, or you'll hurt the instructor." The remark cracked through the air, dragging with its scattered laughter light as the click of a gun's safety, yet filled with implication. Another officer positioned behind her lowered his voice, knowing perfectly well Avery was close enough to hear. "The feds must be out of their minds if they're sending this little girl." He pressed the words "little girl," and the rest immediately burst into louder laughter. Their voices rang over the mats, warming under the sun, carrying the casual disdain common in places where officers saw themselves as a pack and outsiders as something soft to be bent. Avery didn't pause to respond. She continued leading the warm-up, voice steady, but every comment was quietly marked in her mind as she mapped the real power structure of this team. For the demonstration drill, Avery called someone forward to model a basic technique. Dalton stepped out, chin raised, arms crossed. "You want me to act, or you want it real?" he asked with a crooked grin, clearly ready to turn the session into entertainment. A few officers shook their heads, chuckling, waiting to see how Avery would react. She walked toward him with a calm, fluid stance. "Real is better." As she spoke, she pivoted, threading her arm beneath his elbow and locking the joint in a movement so clean no one caught the starting point. Dalton dropped into a staggered bend, his face twisting in a brief, sharp spasm. "That damn hurts." The groan tore out of him with such force that the officers behind him fell completely silent. The air collapsed into a hush, as though someone had pulled out its oxygen. Avery released Dalton and stepped back, giving him room to recover. Ward stood farther down the line, arms folded, eyes fixed on her. His face didn't change, but his gaze darkened by a degree that was hard to interpret. No surprise, something closer to recalibration. He had just seen something he hadn't expected, and it shifted the way he read Avery in an instant. As Avery continued the next section of instruction, Ward bent to pick up his water bottle, then let it drop onto the ground. The sharp thud startled several officers. He spoke quietly, but loud enough for his subordinates to hear. "Teach like that, and Maple Ridge won't last long." His tone was calm yet barbed, a reminder that this place did not welcome disruptions. Still, he didn't interfere. He watched, allowing Avery to reveal her capability on her own terms. He didn't need to interrupt the session. He preferred to observe it, unfold exactly the way he wanted to see it. Foster, standing near the back of the row, watched Avery a little longer than the others. His eyes weren't fully hostile, more curious, impressed even that someone had made Dalton yelp in front of everyone. But before he could look any further, Ward placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing hard enough to make Foster flinch. "Don't stare. She's not part of the team." He stepped back, his initial curiosity extinguished. Ward's comment served as a reminder to the entire unit. Avery's presence was temporary, and no one was to view her as belonging to Maple Ridge. The atmosphere on the mats shifted sharply after the lock on Dalton. There was less laughter now. More eyes on Avery, though not in respect. A group of predators is evaluating the size of their target, testing the boundaries of her endurance. Avery kept instructing with a steady voice and precise movements, but she felt each stare layering an invisible pressure along her spine. The session had stopped being a training exercise. It had become a test no one had announced. Dalton stood at the edge of the mat, rotating the wrist she had pinned, anger and embarrassment swirling across his face. He stayed silent only because Ward remained nearby, but his gaze toward Avery had sharpened. Officers around him noticed it without needing to say a word. A single joint lock had silenced laughter, but it had also sparked a flame in those who needed no reason to resent someone from the outside. As the session neared its end, Avery gathered the training tools. A breeze moved across the field, carrying the smell of sweat and dry grass. She was noting the team's reactions when she heard Rowe speaking quietly to Dalton. "Tomorrow, in the dojo." He spoke in a low voice, full of implication. Dalton smirked. "No one hears anything in there." They exchanged a look, half collusion, half hostility, and shared a short, knowing laugh. Avery did not turn, but she heard enough to mark the comment as a warning. "No one hears anything" was a phrase worth circling in any unit accustomed to burying evidence and shifting blame. This was no longer about training. It was the movement of a pack, tightening around an unfamiliar presence. She kept her expression neutral, though a muted readiness stirred inside her, the instinct of an animal entering an unclaimed territory. Ward ended the session by walking straight through the line, offering no encouragement. As he passed Avery, he came close enough for her to hear him clearly. "Tomorrow, you teach in the dojo. That's where you find out who really runs the class." He didn't look back, but the sentence dragged behind him like a thin blade cutting along the mat. When Ward left the training field, the remaining officers continued watching Avery. But none of them were laughing now. The pack had changed its mind, and tomorrow, the dojo would be where they tested exactly where her limits lay. The break room at the end of the hallway was quieter than usual, filled only with the steady hum of the ventilation fan. Avery sat down and took out the recording device, playing back the audio from that morning's training session. The sound of wind from the field blended with footsteps shifting on the mats. Then the phrase, "this little girl," came through. Slightly warped by distance, but unmistakable in its tone of disdain. Moments later came the burst of laughter from multiple directions. Detached from its context, the audio was even sharper, exposing the true nature of the speakers. Avery replayed it twice, her hand resting on the table as she considered how easily the entire team had targeted her, as if they were well practiced in singling out easy prey. She stood and walked to the window. From here, she could see part of the parking lot below, where Dalton was speaking with Rowe. Dalton gestured with broad, claiming motions, while Rowe grinned with smug satisfaction. Every movement carried the posture of men used to acting like bullies within a crowd. When Ward stepped out from a nearby walkway, he didn't need to say a word. He simply glanced toward them. Dalton straightened immediately. Rowe swallowed his smile, and both of them stood as if awaiting orders. A single look was enough to change the behavior of the entire team. Avery observed the moment closely, marking it as the first key piece of data about the power structure inside Maple Ridge. Returning to the table, she opened her notebook and wrote in neat, concise strokes. Ward, unofficial leader controlling the team's entire tone. New line. Dalton, aggressive enforcer, impulsive. Third line. Rowe, Violence accomplice, escalate situations unnecessarily. She continued. Foster. Wavering. Easily pressured. Final line. Park. Silent. Forced to observe. Not yet able to break from the pack. Each name came from her analysis of their eyes, words, and reactions during the session. This was the first step in understanding how a group compressed by pack culture operated beneath its surface. The door creaked softly as Park walked by. Avery, leaning against the table, called out to him in a tone casual enough not to draw attention. "Training went all right today?" Park startled, his shoulders jerking slightly. "Fine. Just—" They were a bit tense. His last words faded nearly into breath, as if speaking louder might let someone overhear. Avery watched his reaction and recognized that Park was the only one in the group showing genuine fear. Not the performative kind meant to signal loyalty to Ward. Avery responded slowly. "They've been tense for a while. I just noticed it today." Park swallowed a small sigh, lowered his head, and fixed his eyes on the floor as though trying to avoid any gaze that might sweep past. He hurried away, footsteps quickening. His avoidance gave Avery another crucial piece of the puzzle. Someone in the team had been targeted before she arrived, and that sign likely lay somewhere in the files Ward had tried to bury. As Avery returned to her bag to pack away the recorder, she saw movement at the far end of the hallway. Ward leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze locked directly on her. He did not move, but the weight of his stare rested on her like a statement. He had seen her watching his team from different angles. Ward's eyes held no anger, no urgency, more the look of a man who had watched newcomers arrive and disappear without leaving a trace. It told her he had begun to assess her as an opponent rather than a guest at a training session. Before he stepped toward her, Havers called from the office to her left. "Avery, come here a moment." She stepped inside, and the door shut immediately behind her. Havers exhaled, fingers worrying the edge of a folder, as if unsure how much he should say. "I don't know what happened out there today, but ease up on them." His voice carried both suggestion and warning. Avery tilted her head. "Are you afraid of them? Or afraid I'll expose something?" The question made Havers grip the folder tighter. He didn't reply immediately, only glanced toward the door as if fearful of ears pressed against it. His silence said more than a direct answer. Avery understood that Havers wasn't aligned with the pack, but he wasn't willing to break from them either. His role resembled that of someone trying to keep what little order remained in a unit already consumed by a distorted power culture. He didn't want Avery provoking Ward, but he also couldn't explain why. His internal tug-of-war carved the lines inside Maple Ridge even deeper. When Avery stepped out, Ward appeared at the intersection of the hallways and strode toward her. He stopped in front of her, his voice low and clear enough to ripple slightly through the air. "Tomorrow in the dojo, don't expect anyone to be watching from the outside." His tone mimicked an announcement, but carried the weight of a warning. Having seen how composed Avery remained during the morning drills, he seemed eager to test the limits of that composure. He didn't block her path, but his presence cast a long shadow that she had to step around to continue. Avery did not respond. Ward's words always carried two meanings, one directed at her, and another directed at those behind him. The dojo, in the way he emphasized it, was not a space for normal training. It was a closed room where sounds changed shape, where rules bent to the will of whoever held power. Avery walked toward the main doors that led outside. Her phone buzzed inside her pocket. She checked the screen, and the internal system notification appeared clearly. Training location changed to dojo. Full team attendance mandatory. A single line, yet heavier than any drill she had led today. The next morning, the hallway leading to the Maple Ridge dojo was so quiet that Avery could hear her own footsteps hitting the floor. Neon lights above cast a cold glow across the dark green mats, sharpening every line on every face and amplifying the fatigue beneath. Avery paused at the doorway for one measured breath. The air inside felt heavier than the air outside, as though someone had packed it tightly, holding it in a constant, uncomfortable tension. The mix of heated rubber and human breath weighed thickly, reminding her that this was no longer the open training field. This was the wolves' den. Ward stood at the center of the mat, feet shoulder-width apart, hands clasped loosely behind his back. His posture resembled that of an instructor, but his eyes belonged to someone policing his territory. Behind him, Dalton, Rowe, and Foster formed a loose crescent casual in appearance, but unmistakably a frame of containment. Park stood among them as well, but slightly off to the left, too stiff in his attempts to hide his anxiety. Avery set her bag beside the wall and stepped onto the mat. The entire room shifted with her, their eyes following like muted machinery. Dalton tilted his head with a half-smirk and spoke just loud enough. "No kids watching today, so go wild, instructor." The tone sounded playful, but the intent behind it was fully deliberate. Rowe laughed louder, pushing the mockery further. Avery glanced toward the group and answered evenly. "Today, we practice basic control techniques. Follow protocol, don't overdo it." Ward let out a faint laugh. "Whose protocol? Federal or real world?" He began circling her, each step pulling the air tighter. Dalton rolled his wrist, letting an intentional crack echo. Foster shifted aside, trying for a neutral expression but throwing furtive glances toward Ward as if awaiting permission for something. Avery noted it silently. Some links in the chain were loose. Others were bound far too tightly. Both kinds were vulnerabilities in a pack. Ward stopped behind Avery's shoulder. "Here at Maple Ridge, we don't train to dodge. We train to hold our ground when it counts." Avery turned her head just enough to catch his half-smile. "I'm not here to change your identity. I'm here to teach you what keeps you alive," Ward replied. "Alive where? In class or in real life?" Avery said, "Both." In that instant, Dalton let out a sharp laugh. "You talk like someone who's nearly died." Avery looked at him directly. "I haven't died. That's why I'm standing here." Rowe's laughter faded. Ward tilted his head slightly, eyes sharpening. Foster half inhaled to say something, but stayed silent. Instead, Ward raised a hand. "Lock the door." Rowe walked to the entrance and shoved it closed hard. The metal door slammed, and the bolt snapped into place. The sound hit the dojo floor like a marker being driven into the earth, making Park jump. Avery knelt briefly, adjusting her laces with slow precision. Beneath the collar of her shirt, her fingers brushed the SOS switch. She slid it on, with the slightest motion. The system would register that she was entering potential danger, awaiting a second signal to trigger an alert. Avery exhaled slowly, keeping her heartbeat steady. Ward moved back to the center. "All right, instructor, what do we start with? Basic or advanced?" Avery answered, "Pair coordination. One attacks, one defends." Ward nodded. "Who attacks first?" Dalton raised his hand. "Me. I want to see what federal technique looks like." He stepped forward, shoulders flared, as if trying to dominate every inch of space between them. Avery signaled, "Simple, direct strike." Dalton lunged quicker than she expected. Not a controlled training move, but a genuine force-driven charge. Avery pivoted left, caught his wrist, rode his momentum, and redirected his weight with a hip turn. Dalton stomped to regain balance, wobbling but not falling. Ward smiled. "Feds teach dodging well." Avery repositioned and replied, "Dodging is the first step of control." Rowe cut in, "Control who? Real people or us?" Avery answered, "Applied correctly, both." Dalton lunged again, this time using far more strength, breath hot with aggression. She dodged the first strike, but his second was a low hook that forced her back. She recovered, steady-eyed. Ward called out, Speed up. The room changed immediately. A thicker, predatory stillness filled the air. Dalton advanced. Rowe stepped half forward, waiting for an opening to interfere. Foster backed away but kept his eyes glued to Ward. Avery raised her hand. "We're practicing control, not brawling," Ward responded. "You saying that because you're outmatched? Or because you're scared?" Avery met his gaze. "I'm saying it because training has a purpose." Ward shrugged. The purpose changed today. Avery sensed the circle tightening around her. No one was laughing anymore. They were observing, measuring, waiting for Ward's signal. Park muttered under his breath. "This shouldn't be happening." Foster shot him, a silent warning glare. Dalton charged again, but Avery stepped into the pocket of his momentum. A hip rotation and firm redirect sent him to one knee. He gasped, face flushed with pain and humiliation. Rowe prepared to jump in, but Ward raised a hand. "Let her teach. I want the whole show." Avery stood in the center of the forming ring, feeling the invisible weight settle on her shoulders. The dojo was not a training room. It was a proving ground, one where power was defined by who broke first. Ward circled her again and spoke distinctly, each word landing like a pin on a loaded surface. "This session isn't meant to let you walk out of here easily." He stopped directly in front of her. His smile disappeared entirely, and his eyes became a blade poised to slice through the violence-thickened air settling around every man in that room. The atmosphere in the dojo shifted sharply after Ward's final words. The cold air from the vents no longer softened the tension. Instead, it seeped into the muscles of the men surrounding Avery, stirring the entire pack awake. Ward lifted his chin, giving a short signal less an instruction, more a habit ingrained in those who followed him. Dalton understood instantly and stepped forward, his shoulders twitching as though he were about to launch into a real fight. He threw a testing punch, but it was powerful enough that the air cracked around it, nothing like a training strike. Avery leaned aside, feeling the rush of heat skim past her jaw. She seized the split second in which Dalton lost alignment, twisted his wrist backward, and locked the joint in an instant. Dalton let out a hoarse cry, unable to hide the jolt of pain. Rowe blurted out from behind, "For real!" as if he couldn't believe someone dared force Dalton to his knees. Ward's eyes hardened. "Do it. I told you today is real." His voice no longer belonged to an instructor. It was the voice of someone ready to break the rules before anyone realized the rules had already disappeared. Rowe charged in, face flushed with aggression, and with his own need to prove something to Ward. Avery blocked the first two strikes, but the third slid hard into her left shoulder, staggering her. Pain shot down her arm, but she held steady, grounding her stance. A glint of cruelty sparked in Ward's eyes, a look that said, "That's more like it." Foster still stood rooted in place, his hands not knowing whether to clench or release. Avery caught him in her peripheral vision. He was shaking, not because he feared her, but because he feared Ward might see hesitation. Ward turned his head sharply, his voice breaking into a cold command. "Foster, in." Foster stepped forward, as if dragged by a rope, feet slow, but still moving toward her. His eyes darted toward Ward after every step, checking whether he was doing enough. Avery stepped back to create space, but the dojo was too small for three bodies closing in. Foster grabbed her shoulder, but his grip was weak, his hand trembling. Avery pivoted and kicked him lightly in the stomach, just enough to push him back without hurting him. He stumbled, not yet falling. Before she could regain her full stance, Ward was already behind her, as if he had predicted her movement seconds earlier. He spoke near her ear, his voice dry and scraping like metal against stone. "You think you came here to teach? No. You came so we could test you." Avery spun away from him while scanning the room, the floor, the spacing to the door, each man's position. Dalton crouched, face red with pain and humiliation. Rowe steadied himself, his excitement burning bright. Foster wavered, caught between prey and predator. Park stood farthest, frozen like carved wood. Ward circled in front of Avery, herding her toward the section of the mat where no exit existed. She glanced at the door again. The lock sat there cold, final. She understood then that from the moment she stepped inside, this had never been a training session. This was a test to see where she would break. Dalton lunged again, this time using his full strength. Avery rotated her hips, blocked his punch, and redirected his momentum into the mat. He slid, rolled, and recovered quickly, no longer smirking. Hatred had replaced humor on his face. Rowe cut in, swinging a low kick. Avery blocked it, but was forced back half a step. Ward watched everything with the eyes of someone waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He didn't rush. He wanted his subordinates to exhaust her, to destabilize her, and only then step in for the final blow. He wanted her to understand that she was outside the pack, therefore without the right to survive here. At last, Ward's glare pushed Foster forward again. Foster approached, each movement revealing his internal struggle. Avery saw it in his eyes and felt no anger toward him. Men like Foster had been swallowed by pack culture long ago. They had no exits left. She redirected his wrist gently, intentionally avoiding to let him know she understood he did not want this. But that small mercy opened the gap Ward had been waiting for. He swept in, arriving in front of her at a distance, close enough that she felt his breath. "You're holding up well," he said. "But in here, no one gives you a way out." He lifted his chin. Dalton and Rowe moved simultaneously, forming a half-circle behind her. The escape route tightened with every second. Avery touched her collar lightly, checking the SOS indicator again. The light was on, but the system needed the second press, the signal that she acknowledged the shift into a life-threatening situation. She waited for the right moment. Not yet. Not while Ward could read her intentions. Dalton struck first, knocking her arm aside. She spun, avoiding him. But Rowe was already closing from the right. His punch grazed her cheek, leaving a burning streak. Ward stood behind her, voice low but ringing through the dojo. "Push harder. I want to know how long she lasts. Is Cleve Dan?" Park sucked in a breath, as if he wanted to shout something, but fear choked the words. Foster's eyes flashed with despair. Avery saw it instantly. In this pack, only 2 men still had fragments of conscience. But Ward wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Avery. He wanted her to know he held the rhythm. He alone would decide how this ended. Avery backed up, calculating. There was a narrow gap between Rowe and Foster, but too small to escape without being caught. She needed a moment. A mistake. A misstep. Anything that could throw off their coordinated ring. Ward's voice rose, stripped of any restraint. "Don't let her leave this room." The instant the words fell, Dalton roared, and the circle slammed shut. And Avery understood the moment she pressed that second SOS trigger had arrived. The dojo mat had warmed under footsteps, body heat, and the hiss of air displaced by impact. Avery stood at the edge of the tightening circle, hands raised in a defensive stance, her breathing tense but steady. She knew she could not take down the entire group with bare-knuckle combat, nor could she use the lethal techniques of a federal agent. She had to balance everything at the razor's edge, strong enough to survive, controlled enough not to kill. The hardest part wasn't fighting. It was restraining herself. Rowe charged first, muscles bulging, and eyes reddened with excitement. He no longer believed he was in a training class. This was the fight of men eager to defend their place in the pack. Avery shifted her weight, blocked his forward momentum, and rotated her hips to use his own force to slam him to the mat. The thud of his body hitting the floor rang sharp. Rowe groaned, clutching his shoulder as he rolled aside. Dalton lunged in immediately, growling like a wounded animal. He swung a punch straight at her face, hard enough to make the air tremble ahead of his fist. Avery tilted her head, feeling the heat glide past her cheekbone. She spun and drove her elbow into Dalton's jaw. The sound of teeth clicking together rang sharp, like metal pulled taut. Dalton staggered backward, wobbling but refusing to fall. Foster hovered behind them, unsure. His feet shifted, but his eyes stayed glued to Ward, searching for a cue. He didn't want to join the fight that was obvious in every stiff, reluctant movement, but standing aside was even more dangerous. Ward noticed his hesitation and barked a command that cracked across the mat. "Go!" Foster flinched, stumbling forward even though his movements were too clumsy to threaten anyone. Avery caught his wrist, twisting gently along the natural hinge, causing pain without injury. Foster yelped under his breath, eyes flickering with shame and fear. Avery kept her breathing controlled, but her body was taking pressure from all sides. Every strike, dodge, and pivot was calculated like a survival exam. She wasn't here to win. Winning wasn't the goal. The only goal was escape. Ward advanced like a moving slab of stone, each of his steps sending small ripples through the air. Without warning, he lunged his punch twice as powerful as any thrown before. Avery lifted both arms to block, but the impact shoved her backward across the mat. Her shoulder flared with pain, spreading into a sharp electric burn. Ward saw it and smirked, cold, curved, dangerous. Avery pivoted, kicking at Ward's knee to break his stance. But his body felt like steel. He staggered, yet did not fall. His balance was too practiced, too anchored, as if he had trained under every possible terrain. He let out a short, mocking laugh. "You think those basics will take me down?" Dalton and Rowe were still groaning on the mat but had not fully dropped out. Foster retreated toward a corner, trembling hands held close to his chest. Park stood by the wall, wide-eyed, lips pressed tight. Avery caught real fear in Park's expression. Not fear of her, but fear of the people he worked with every day. Ward began circling her, each step measured like the ticking of a clock. He studied her breaths, her posture, her timing the way a predator studies the heartbeat of its prey before striking. "Not bad," he murmured, voice low and dangerous. "But alone is still alone." Avery flicked her gaze toward the door. The distance wasn't far, about 8 strides in a full sprint. But Ward stood directly in that line, a tall barrier cutting off any chance of slipping past. She couldn't outrun him. He'd drag her down before she even touched the lock. To escape, she needed him off balance. She needed one step. Just one. Backward. Ward followed her eyes and smirked. "Don't even dream. That exit belongs to me." Avery inhaled deeply. She felt every heartbeat, every pain point, each muscle threading into fatigue. She had to end this fast. Park wouldn't intervene. Foster was trapped in his forced loyalty. Dalton and Rowe were struggling upright again. The door was shut. The SOS hadn't been triggered a second time. She needed space. A window of seconds. Dalton crawled up, teeth clenched more from humiliation than pain. He lunged, but Avery caught the timing. She spun and drove her heel into his stomach just as he rose, knocking the breath from him. Dalton flew backward and hit the mat face first. Rowe rose at the same time, but his neck was still stiff from earlier, slowing him down. Avery darted forward, planted a hand on his shoulder, and shoved downward, forcing him back to the floor. Ward watched, his eyes growing darker as he saw his men fall one after another. He inhaled sharply, tamping down the frustration rising in his chest. "All these years, and I've never seen an outsider pull this off." "What are you trying to prove?" Avery answered. "I'm trying to walk out of here alive." Ward shrugged once. "Then that's unfortunate for you." He lunged like a storm, his strike so fast and heavy, the air between them seemed to tear open. Avery ducked, sliding right. Ward turned instantly, intercepting her path with a near-instinctive grab. She twisted free, but the effort drained precious strength. She edged a step toward the door, seeking any angle of escape. That was when Ward cut her off, his hand landing on her shoulder, not gripping, just resting, but heavy enough to deliver the message that he could lock down on her at any second. His breath brushed her ear, hot and dense with threat. He whispered, voice sharp as a blade dragged across stone. "You want to leave? Then step over my dead body." Ward took a step as heavy as a sledgehammer, then suddenly swung a hook so powerful the air around his fist vibrated. Avery tilted aside, feeling the force slice past her ear. She rotated her hips and countered with a straight kick to his flank. The impact made Ward stumble for half a second. For the first time since the session began, he lost balance. The sensation seemed to stun him, then his expression darkened, as though night had fallen across his face. Dalton saw it happen, his voice trembling. "Sarge, stop. She's too strong." Ward turned toward him, his stare sharp enough to cut through Dalton's throat. "Shut up." Dalton lowered his head instantly, shoulders tucking inward, pack instinct snapping him into silence, as if someone had taken away his right to think. Foster stood near the wall, uncertain whether he should run or jump in. His gaze flicked between Avery and Ward, as if witnessing two worlds collide. Avery retreated with deliberate steps, her right hand reaching behind until her fingertips brushed the door handle. The cold metal shot clarity up her arm. That wasn't just the exit to a training room, it was the boundary between life and the hallway outside, Ward noticed. His expression shifted from rage to something deeper, darker, as he had finally found a reason to release everything he'd been storing inside. The dojo fell silent, so silent the breathing of each person became its own sound. Rowe pushed against the mat, trying to stand. Dalton clenched his jaw, eyes bloodshot, but too afraid to move. Foster trembled, lifting his hand halfway before dropping it helplessly. Park stared, feet glued to the floor. Everything froze. Everyone was waiting for one sentence. Ward took a very slow step, but each footfall condensed violence into the air. He leaned toward Avery, his voice low enough to be a whisper, yet ringing like metal dragged across concrete. "Kill her!" No one moved. Dalton held his breath, his face draining of color. Rowe swallowed, the sound loud in the sealed room. Foster choked out a half-formed protest. "Sarge, that..." But Ward's stare crushed the rest of the sentence. His look forced Foster into silence, pushing him back a half-step. In that instant, Avery tightened her fingers. Beneath her clothing, the SOS device vibrated faintly, the first trigger already activated. One more unmistakable threat to her life, and the system would automatically register a federal emergency and send an alert. Ward's order counted as exactly that. She knew she had evidence. But evidence didn't matter if she didn't survive long enough to hand it over. Ward roared like a beast struck raw. "Do it!" He lunged faster than any strike before. He no longer fought with technique. He attacked with the speed of someone intent on killing. Avery exhaled hard, slipping sideways past the first blow. Ward's missed punch slammed into the doorframe behind her with a dry, brutal crack. The entire dojo shuddered. If that strike had landed on her skull, she wouldn't have survived. She flicked the lock just as Dalton charged from the left. His attack abandoned any illusion of training. His movement was pure panic and adrenaline. Avery braced a hand on the doorframe, pivoted, and drove her foot into his knee to shove him off the escape line. Dalton collapsed, knuckles hitting the mat, his face twisted with pain and shock. Rowe, having just pushed himself upright, shouted, "Ward, she's running!" Ward twisted his massive frame toward her, but his size cost him a half-second of recovery. Avery slipped through the opening, cold hallway air hitting her like a lifeline. Behind her, Ward launched forward, his footsteps pounding so hard the door frame rattled again. The hallway was long and empty. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, flashing with each stride she took. She ran close to the wall to avoid being grabbed from behind. Breath sharp, but steady every step measured to avoid stumbling. Behind her came the thunder of Ward's pursuit, his fists slamming into walls when he turned, like an enraged animal denied its prey. While sprinting, Avery shoved her hand into her collar and pressed the SOS trigger a second time. She didn't need to look. The signal was sent. A faint light blinked beneath the fabric. Outside the dojo, the system would flag the event as a red-level emergency, but rescue would have to race death to reach her. Ward roared from close behind. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice cracked apart. No longer human, more the howl of someone whose final mask had been torn away. Avery did not look back. She could not waste even 1 second. She darted into a side corridor, shoes scraping sharply across the tile. She knew Ward was stronger, more durable, but she also knew his explosive speed wouldn't outlast trained endurance. She needed him winded before he could reach her. Above, a security camera rotated toward them. Avery saw it and understood. Everything in the dojo might now be registering as abnormal movement. Ward barreled through the turn, his shoulder smashing the wall and knocking plaster loose. He screamed again, the sound slamming into the empty hallway. "Stop!" Avery heard it and sprinted faster. She whipped around a sharp corner, using her hand against the wall to pivot. Her feet landing lightly, as if weightless. The distance between them closed and stretched in pulses, but she could still feel his breath burning on her neck. She spotted the stairwell leading down to the lower floor. A flare of hope cut through the chaos. She sprinted toward it, preparing to leap 2 steps at a time, when behind her came a thunderous sound. Ward launching into another charge, faster now, more reckless. Avery grabbed the railing and turned to descend. And Ward's fist slashed through the air behind her, missing by inches, smashing into the concrete wall. The impact cracked the surface in a thin white fracture. Ward roared, consumed by fury. Avery burst out of the stairwell with the speed of someone who knew a skull-crushing hand was reaching for her from behind. She slid 3 steps across the smooth tile, bracing her palms against the wall to steady herself. The metal door of the dojo slammed shut behind her at the exact moment Ward's fist struck it from inside, the sound exploding like compressed thunder in the narrow hallway. The entire frame rattled, then fell silent, leaving a terrifying hush like the dark space between 2 heartbeats. Ward roared, his voice strangled by fury. "Get back here!" Avery backed away from the door, shoulders heaving. Beneath her shirt, the SOS device pulsed once, then shifted into red mode, its silent vibration hitting her ribs like an extra heartbeat. The signal was transmitting data to the system. Location, pulse, speed. Without a single spoken word, headquarters already knew the embedded agent was in real danger. Footsteps echoed at the far end of the hall. A storage room officer stepped out, frowning at the sight of Avery, breathless, hair disheveled, sweat streaking her jawline. "What happened?" he asked, surprise edging his voice. Before Avery could answer, Ward's voice echoed from inside the dojo, hoarse and strained but forced into something casual. "Just went a little hard in training." The sentence sounded brittle, like a thin sheet of ice covering a gaping crack. The officer glanced at the door, then at Avery, suspicion flaring in his expression. But he didn't dare ask further. In Maple Ridge, everyone learned to keep distance from trouble, especially when the trouble breathed with Ward's lungs. Avery turned and sprinted toward the monitoring room. Each step sent a jolt through her left shoulder, but she kept her posture straight. At the door, she knocked hard and pushed inside. The technician stared at her, as if she'd just walked out of a battlefield, still trying to process what he was seeing. "I need the supervisor." "Now," Avery said. her voice strained, but still firm. Before he could respond, the internal phone rang. He lifted the receiver, listened, then handed it to her. "It's Hale." Avery pressed the phone to her ear. Hale's voice came through urgent and cold. "Avery, stay exactly where you are. Response units are on the way." She leaned against the wall as a wave of dizziness washed over her. Her hands pressed into the console for stability. "Ward? He almost killed me." The words weren't panicked, they were factual, immediate, part of the report she had to deliver. Hale paused for half a second, then spoke in a tone sharp as a blade, dragging across steel. "Hold yourself together." Dojo cameras didn't capture the whole scene, but the door logs did. "They'll review everything." Avery closed her eyes briefly to steady her breathing. She could feel adrenaline draining out of her system, leaving behind pain and exhaustion. But she refused to crumble. Behind that metal door, Ward was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to keep the unit under his thumb. Outside, federal sirens cut through the air. Not the long local police wail, this was the short, sharp, heavy signal of a special response team. Everyone in Maple Ridge heard it. The monitoring room shifted instantly, tension rising like static. Officers in the hallway halted mid-stride, glancing around with a mix of fear and confusion. Maple Ridge was used to a polished silence. When federal vehicles rolled up to a station's front door, it was never minor. Avery stepped aside from the doorway, angling for a view. The hallway corner reflected flashes of red lights from the incoming vehicles. The air shifted like wind shifting before a storm. Footsteps pounded outside, radios crackled non-stop, and keys clattered in the management office. Avery looked down at her hand, still faintly trembling from impact with Ward. Her left shoulder burned like fire sweeping across bone. But worse than the physical pain was the sense that the battle wasn't over. The man who attacked her was still free on the other side of that hallway. A lock clicked behind her. Avery turned. Ward stepped out of the dojo. Sweat streaked down his throat, his shirt soaked, his breath still ragged, but his face showed no fear. Instead, his eyes were cold steel plunged into ice water. For a moment, he looked at Avery as if carving her image into his memory, promising repayment. Officers nearby split apart instinctively, creating space without being told. Ward's presence never made them comfortable, but now the tension was carved into the room itself. Everyone knew something had happened behind that metal door, but no one dared ask. Ward walked toward Avery and the technician, each footstep heavy as a hammer. He stopped, wiped a smear of blood from his lip, studied the red stain on his finger, and smirked. "You should watch what you say." His tone was level and quiet, but each word dropped like a stone into water, sending ripples of controlled intimidation. The technician glanced from Avery to Ward, clearly at a loss. Avery held her expression steady, revealing not even a flicker of fear. She knew that if she showed weakness, Ward would twist the narrative to his advantage. She answered, voice cold and clear. "I'll say exactly what happened." Ward's smile thinned, his eyes deepening into something like a bottomless well. "Then I hope you remember it right." A figure appeared at the end of the hallway, the on-duty captain of Maple Ridge, his face drained when he saw the federal vehicles outside and the tension coiling inside the station. Ward turned slowly, his expression shifting in an instant from threatening to controlled calm, as if nothing had happened at all. Avery recognized the tactic. Shape the story with demeanor. Make anyone who didn't witness the event hesitate before believing the accusation. But this time, he wouldn't slip away. The SOS in Avery's shirt vibrated again, confirmation that all data had been transmitted. The location pinpointed, the situation flagged as high risk. And this place, Maple Ridge, would no longer belong to Ward within minutes. Outside, car doors slammed. Heavy footsteps surged toward the entrance. Avery sat inside the temporary interrogation room the FBI had set up right here in Maple Ridge. White light reflected off the metal table, bright enough to reveal the bruising on her shoulder and along her forearm. The door clicked shut behind her, cutting off nearly all noise from the hallway, leaving only the low hum of the ceiling vent. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady her breathing, but the images from the dojo still clung to the corners of her mind like shadows refusing to fade. Hale entered moments later, shutting the door with a quiet push. He placed a recorder in the center of the table without sitting, his gaze tracing Avery's injuries as if measuring each one. "The audio's a mess," he said, his voice dropping lower. "But Ward's whisper, we heard it." Avery sat straighter, her heartbeat shifting direction the moment the words reached her. Hale pressed play, and distorted sounds of chaos spilled into the small room. Heavy breathing, feet scraping across mats, sharp collisions like metal dragged across the floor. A stretch of static buzzed, and then Ward's voice emerged low, rough, and compressed by the tight air inside the dojo. "Kill her!" Even distorted, the tone carried the weight of the intent Avery had heard inches from her ear. She tilted her head slightly, fingers gripping the side of her chair, grounding herself so memory wouldn't blur into imagination. "It wasn't an accident," Avery said, voice low but firm. He switched the monitor to the door log, displaying the exact timeline showing the dojo door locked from the inside throughout the session. Avery stared at the long red bar across the screen, every minute recorded, every second marking a decision Ward assumed would stay hidden. The cold precision of the data let her exhale slowly. From the adjacent interrogation room, Rowe's voice seeped faintly through the two-way glass, enough for Avery to tell he was trying to dodge something. Rowe claimed it was just training, that everything happened so fast, that she overreacted. Hale tipped his head toward that room, his first statement. Avery looked at her faint reflection in the glass, a thin outline, while the truth lay in how they scrambled to protect one another. Dalton was brought into the next room. He pressed his lips together as the investigator read the door log aloud. "I don't remember everything," Dalton muttered, eyes glued to the table as if afraid to relive Ward shouting orders. "We were just going hard." It was loud. The investigator repeated the question 3 times. The answers circled the same fog. Hale jotted a note quickly. "Evasive testimony. Cognitive conflict. Is another tour." In the third room, Foster sat with his whole body twisting, instead of just his eyes, hands woven together, as if trying to hold on to the last threads of composure. Avery heard the soft scrape of a file being placed in front of him. Then Foster's voice thin enough to sound unlike a grown man. "Ward said, 'Go harder.' I didn't think it would go that far." After that sentence, he stopped, inhaling sharply, as he'd finally crossed a line he'd spent years avoiding. Hale turned off the monitors and faced Avery. "You see? Every one of them says something different." Avery nodded lightly. The atmosphere of Maple Ridge over the past days resurfaced vividly. The glances, the uneven shoulders when they stood near Ward, the ready posture waiting for his cue. The pack bond had seemed solid, but hit the right point, and the entire net began to crack. A tech specialist knocked and entered, setting a stack of extracted audio images on the table. On the pages were distorted spectrograms of the fight, warped waves stretching across the horizontal axis. Avery focused on the segment containing Ward's voice. Even degraded and lower in pitch, the phrase, "kill her," formed the distinctive shape of a human whisper spoken with deliberate intent. Hale said, "We'll clean it up further, but this is already enough to cross-check against their statements." Avery leaned back in her chair, feeling exhaustion spread from her shoulder down her spine. There was no victory in her expression, only the residue of having come too close to a line no officer should be pushed toward. The dojo door closed in her memory with Ward's roar and his fists slamming metal, clearer evidence than any polished narrative they would later write in their reports. When Avery stood to get water, she caught the hallway footage playing on one of the monitors the moment she burst out of the dojo. The door nearly slammed into her, and Ward's fist struck the frame. The thud echoed in the monitoring room like a hammer against glass. Dry, sharp, making the techs exchange glances. "Matches the door log," Hale said, "and contradicts everything they claimed." Avery returned to her seat slowly. Her voice was quieter than usual. "They'll stay silent." Hale didn't disagree. He flipped through a file and replied, "But that silence is starting to tear. Not because they want to talk, because the data is talking for them." Avery stared at the small recorder on the table, lying still like a tireless witness. The door opened. A junior agent stepped in with a blue folder tucked under his arm. He whispered something to Hale, and Hale's expression shifted slightly. Avery waited. She knew the next phase of the investigation wouldn't come from testimony or camera logs or distorted waveforms, but from the people powerful enough to step in exactly when the ground started to move. Hale placed the folder in front of her. His tone was calm, but strained like a cord tugged one notch too tight. "Avery," he said, eyes fixed on the folder cover. "Someone just requested to join the case. Dana Ward." The hallway of Maple Ridge sank into a dense silence when Dana Ward stepped through the glass doors, moving like a misplaced winter wind. Her long coat swept lightly across the tile floor, creating a thin, sharp sound that pulled every gaze toward her. In countless files, Dana was the steel-spined attorney respected across the FBI for her ability to stay calm in any storm. But today, that calm was gone, replaced by a tightened face and eyes holding something too heavy to hide. Avery stood beside Hale, watching the woman's arrival the way one watches a glacier crack from within. Dana walked straight toward them. No hesitation, no searching, no pause. When she stopped in front of Avery, her gaze traveled from the bruise on Avery's shoulder to the steady eyes that refused to drop even a fraction. "You're the one who dragged my son into this mess?" Dana's voice was low, smooth, but sharp as a blade. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. Avery met her eyes calmly, neither confrontational nor retreating. Before she could answer, Hale stepped half a pace forward, forming an invisible barrier. "Mrs. Ward, due to conflict of interest regulation, you are removed from the case effective immediately. We need you to leave the interrogation area." His voice wasn't loud, but crystal clear, each word cracking through the hallway's breathless stillness. Dana looked at Hale, her lips pressing tight, her expression shifting from anger to cold restraint. "I know the law," she said, each word measured, "and I know how to bend it." No one spoke after that. The air hung motionless, broken only by the muted hum of the ventilation system. When Dana turned back to Avery, the sharpness in her expression softened into something mixed tension. "Lucas can be hot-tempered," she said quietly, her voice trembling at the end. "But he is not a murderer." The statement wasn't an attack. It was a mother clinging to the last belief she could still hold. Avery didn't look away. "I didn't say he was a murderer," she replied, steady but heavy enough to make Dana examine the words. "He said that." For a heartbeat, Dana froze, as if struck by wind, straight to the face. Just 1 second, yet enough for Avery to see the crack running through the belief this mother had been gripping so tightly. But Dana pulled herself together quickly, rebuilding the armor she'd worn for years. "I won't let you people destroy his life." She dropped the sentence onto the tile floor like a vow, then turned sharply away. Avery watched the sweep of her coat fade down the hallway, feeling something difficult to name rising within her. She'd seen people protect teammates, reputations, and personal gain. But watching a mother stand against a federal investigation purely to protect her child was something else entirely. It wasn't malice, nor manipulation. It was primal, a force powerful enough to push a mother to the edge of blindness. Hale stepped beside her. "You expected this," he murmured. Avery nodded. "She's been known for a long time. Known for being smart," Hale corrected, "and for being someone no one wants to cross." Down the hallway, Dana paused next to a bench. She pulled out her phone, dialed without hesitation. Her voice was low, but the strain leaked through a person carrying both the weight of a legal mind and the weight of motherhood. "Activate every connection I have," she said, striking each word. "If they want a fight, I'll give them one." Avery heard it not because she was eavesdropping, but because the hallway was too quiet for tension like that to go anywhere else. And in that moment, she felt the pull of two forces tearing the air. Justice on one side, maternal instinct on the other. In a shadowed place like this, neither could win fully. Hale motioned for Avery to return to the interrogation room. "We need to prepare for Phase 2, he said, reviewing the newest file from the tech team. "Things are going to get much more complicated now that Dana Ward is involved. She's smart, she knows exactly how the system works, and she knows which cracks can be pried open." Avery sat again, placing both hands on the table's edge to center her thoughts. "I don't fear her," she said slowly, "but I understand a mother's fear." Hale studied her for a moment, then nodded. "No one blames her for that, but our job is to keep the line clear." On the screen, the audio analysis continued to show clipped, warped, and reconstructed waves. Behind the glass, the tech specialist signaled that a cleaner version was ready. Avery followed the motion briefly, then returned her attention to the display. She knew one distorted sentence from Ward had already created a storm, but facing Dana Ward would be the challenge she couldn't underestimate. Outside, the afternoon light dimmed through the tall windows. The Maple Ridge building appeared motionless, not from peace, but from an entire unit holding its breath for the storm creeping toward it. A federal investigation never passed through a place without leaving marks, and Dana's presence only sharpened the incoming impact. Avery rose, walking a slow circle to loosen her shoulders before drawing a deep breath. The tension from the dojo, the escape, and the web of conflicting testimonies pressed down on her like heavy water. But she stayed balanced, not from hardness, but from experience whispering that moments like this were exactly when walls of silence began to shake. As she settled back into her seat, the internal phone rang. Hale picked up, listened briefly, then looked at Avery. His expression held no alarm, but it clearly signaled that something had shifted. He set down the phone, stepped closer, and lowered his voice. "Avery, get ready." She tilted her head. "For what?" Hale handed her a note freshly sent from Maple Ridge's HR division. "An internal witness wants to meet you," he said, locking eyes with her to emphasize the gravity of the moment. "And they don't want anyone to know." The equipment room sat at the far end of the back hallway, where the light was always dimmer, and footsteps from outside vanished the moment they touched the door. Avery pushed open the metal door, and before her was Evan Park seated on a folding chair, his head buried in his hands, shoulders trembling in a silence heavy as lead. The stacked training crates around him made it feel as though he had locked himself inside a dark corner no one else could reach. Park didn't lift his head when Avery entered, but his breathing shifted, as if he knew she was there. Avery stepped forward slowly, letting the sound of her shoes on the floor stay soft enough not to startle him. "You asked for me?" she said, standing far enough away to avoid pressuring him. Park nodded, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were reddened, not from crying, but from holding back tears that had been trapped behind his composure. I can't take this anymore. Eakin." Avery pulled a nearby chair closer and sat beside him, keeping just enough distance for him to feel safe. The air in the cramped room was so still, she could hear the faint hiss of the vent above them. "You don't have to speak until you're ready," Avery said, her voice steady, offering him an anchor. Park drew a long breath, but his hands continued to shake. as if everything he was about to say could tilt the rest of his life in one direction or another. "What? What were they planning to do to you in there?" Park asked, voice low, barely audible even to himself. I heard the sounds. I saw the door lock. After speaking, he lowered his head again, clasping his hands together tightly. His body language was not that of someone hiding guilt, but of someone who had lived too long beside a wrong and had reached his breaking point. Avery tilted her head slightly. "You saw more than what you've said." The words made Park freeze. He turned to look at the door behind Avery, as though afraid someone could be standing there at any moment. The small room magnified the feeling that secrets could be overheard too easily. And the pack instilled fear in Park had become instinct. "Sarge? He's not the same anymore," Park whispered. "He's like someone else. When he steps into the dojo, his eyes, they're not a police officer's eyes." Park swallowed, his vision blurring with restrained turmoil. "I've seen that look a few times before. Each time, someone got hurt. Nobody says anything." Avery straightened slightly, letting Park see her seriousness. "You're afraid of losing your job?" she asked gently, not to corner him, but to give him a name for the fear he'd been carrying. Park let out a short laugh, brittle and hollow as breaking foam. "Losing my job would be the easy part. Anyone who goes against the pack becomes the target. I've seen that too." Eder. Avery stayed silent for a few moments, giving him space, letting him realize that what he'd just said was the first fracture in the silence Maple Ridge had spent years forcing onto its people. Park leaned his head back against the wall, staring at the ceiling as if trying to retrieve a memory he had buried too deep. "Ward," he said, voice trembling. "Sarge keeps pushing everything further. Dalton and Rowe follow him because they're scared. Foster, he's half out the door, half dragged back in." He paused, then lowered his voice even more. I've never seen them like they were in that dojo." "What did you see?" Avery asked. Park opened his eyes and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd entered the room. "I saw the door close. I saw Rowe cover the latch with his hand. I saw Dalton wrap his fists, not with the kind of tapes we use for basic training." His voice grew hoarse. "Then I heard the heavy hits. And your voice." Avery inhaled slowly. "Did you tell anyone?" Park shook his head immediately. So fast Avery understood exactly how deeply fear had rooted itself. No one wants to know. No one dares to know. In this unit, silence is the unwritten rule. He gripped the edge of his chair. "I've been silent for too long." In that moment, Avery saw the torment branching beneath Park's skin like roots. He wasn't guilty, but he had witnessed too many wrongs and lived in fear of being swallowed by them at any moment. That fracture was something Ward had never noticed, but Avery could see it clearly. Park bowed his head again, shoulders sagging. "If you need me, I'll talk. But—" He stopped, his voice thinning as if being strangled from inside. "But only if I'm sure you won't die because of this." The statement wasn't dramatic. Park truly believed Avery could have died in the dojo. He had heard it in the sounds, the shouts, the panic thrumming through the walls. He hadn't needed to see it, to know. Avery placed her hands on her knees and leaned slightly closer, making her voice feel nearer but never forceful. "I'm still here, and I need you to stand on the side of truth, not on the side of fear." As though the sentence struck a place he'd kept locked for years. A place he hadn't known how badly he needed someone to speak to. A draft slipped through the doorway crack, stirring the loose papers on the shelves. Park glanced down at his phone resting on his thigh, his finger trembling. In that moment, a soft vibration echoed in the small room. The screen lit up with Maple Ridge's internal message alert. Park looked at it, and the expression on his face changed instantly. Avery saw the shift. "Who is it?" she asked. Park swallowed tightly, lips pressing together as though pricked by an old, painful memory. He turned the screen toward Avery, wanting to show her and hide from it at the same time. On the screen was a short, clean, emotionless message, but carrying exactly the tone that made this entire unit coil like a rope pulled too tight. Message from Ward, if you're free, meet me now. Need to talk. Park looked at Avery, his eyes wide, fear no longer contained. The overhead light reflected on the phone's surface, making the message blaze bright between them like a warning. The shadow of Ward was stretching closer with every second. Interrogation Room 3 sat apart from the main row of rooms, where the air conditioning was always a few degrees colder, turning the atmosphere thick and biting. Foster sat in the center of the room, both hands resting on the steel table as if they no longer belonged to him. Sweat streamed down his temples and into his collar, even though the thermostat on the wall displayed 18 degrees. The white ceiling light washed over him, making his face look even paler than the faint bruise on his cheek. The investigator across from Foster, a middle-aged man with a patient yet razor-sharp presence, rolled a pen between his fingers, then paused and tapped it against the table. "You said 3 people attacked," the investigator began, his voice steady as a ticking clock. "She said 4 were present. Do you want to correct that?" Foster swallowed, the sound dry and harsh. He looked down at the table, then up at the two-way mirror, as though someone behind it might hand him an answer. I don't remember clearly," Foster stammered, each word falling from his mouth like fragments of a crumbling defense. The investigator didn't reply immediately. He turned the screen toward Foster and played the dojo door log. The timeline appeared, marking the exact moment the door was locked from inside, and stayed that way throughout the session. Foster stared at it as if watching his own verdict scroll across the screen. Next, the investigator played the filtered audio. The small room filled with chaotic sounds from the fight. Shoes scraping the mat, harsh breaths, and the compressed thud of force cutting through the air. Then, Ward's voice surfaced, distorted, but still sharp enough to slice skin. "Kill her." Foster froze, eyes widening as if an icy needle had been driven into his spine. His fingers dug into the table's edge until the veins stood out. The investigator tilted his head. "You heard that before?" Foster whispered. "Yes." His voice was no longer that of an adult, but of a child whose worst secret had just been exposed. "What did you do at that moment?" the investigator asked, not louder, but heavier. Foster shut his eyes, and in that instant, tears pushed through. I just stood there," he said, voice splintering. "I was more afraid of Ward than of being wrong. I don't know. I don't know who I am anymore." The investigator slid a glass of water toward him. "You have a chance to make it right. A last chance." The words weren't a threat, but their weight was undeniable. Foster bent forward, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently. The muffled sobs vibrated through the suffocating stillness, like a guitar string stretched past its limit, moments from snapping. "I'll talk," Foster said, his voice breaking like rotted wood under a hammer. "All of it. Ward, it's not just this. There's more. Other times, other people, whoever got hurt before." He inhaled sharply, then shook his head in defeat. "I'm scared to say it. But I'm even more scared of staying silent." The investigator did not pat his shoulder or offer comfort. He simply noted something down and powered on the formal recorder. Foster began speaking. Not in order, not with structure. The words poured out like a door, ripped off its hinges after years of being wedged shut. He recounted a training session 2 months earlier, when a new officer was slammed into a wall by Dalton, hard enough to draw blood during a so-called strength test, and Ward watched without intervening. He recounted an incident in the parking lot when Rowe bullied Park so badly that the young officer didn't go home for 3 days. Then he described things Ward whispered, after training sessions, things no audio filter ever caught. Strong teams don't need reports. Weak men create trouble. Anyone who talks won't last in Maple Ridge. Foster trembled as he repeated those lines, as though he couldn't believe he had once heard them or that he had stayed silent through it all. In the adjacent room, where Avery sat with Hale, each word fell like a nail hammered into a wall of truth. Maple Ridge had tried to keep sealed. Inside the interrogation room, Foster finally lifted his head, tears blurring his vision, but clarity shining through for the first time. "Ward has changed," he said. "He's not the man I used to trust as a commander. He looks at everyone like an enemy. I'm scared of him, but I'm even more scared of the person I'll become if I keep following him." The investigator captured the last of his statement, then turned off the recorder. He stood, gathered his papers, and left without a single judgmental word. None was needed. Foster's collapse spoke for itself. He remained seated, clutching his head, his ragged breathing echoing through the too-quiet room. When the investigator stepped into the hallway, Hale was waiting. The man handed him a USB containing the recording without explanation. But he did offer one sentence, quiet in volume, massive in weight, like a stone rolling in a canyon. "We have our first one down?" "Effent." Hale looked at the USB, then at the room where Foster sat crumpled before the table. What was unfolding wasn't just testimony. It was the unraveling of a system Ward had believed untouchable. One domino had fallen, and the others were starting to tremble in an irreversible chain. "The dominoes are going to start falling," the investigator said. In the DOJ's temporary office set up right inside the administrative complex, white lights shone down on stacks of files piled high like paper walls surrounding the conference table. The scent of fresh documents mixed with cooling coffee created the distinct atmosphere of nights before a court hearing. The head of investigation stood before the data board, his voice steady and certain. "There are no gaps left. Everything has been cross-checked. Tomorrow, we take it to court." Hale placed the USB and the printed sound spectrum on the table, the short excerpt of Ward's voice appearing like a single, clean slash. "Kill her." The chief did not need to hear it again, yet he still nodded, as though confirming the legal weight of a sentence that had become the final anchor of the indictment. "That line alone is enough," Hale said, his voice cooled by exhaustion and resolve. Avery leaned against the doorframe, her hand gripping the edge of her jacket as though to keep herself grounded against the heaviness settling over her. The glow from the data screens reflected across her face, revealing the tension she had buried deep. Hale glanced at her. "You good?" he asked, not out of politeness, but as someone who understood the undercurrent inside her. Avery replied, "I don't want them using system failure as an excuse. They need to answer for every action." "I know." A younger investigator standing nearby, reviewing the evidence list, looked up. "No. This is attempted murder at the federal level. Ward can't dodge this." He issued the command deliberately, no legal basis for calling it negligence. He turned the page, his expression hardening. "Dalton and Rowe as well. Foster is the only one with a chance at a reduced sentence because he cooperated early." Meanwhile, in the temporary holding cell at Maple Ridge, the air smelled completely different. Ward stood against the wall, hands clasped in front of him, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the room, as if he were still in the dojo, still the one standing at the center of the pack. Dalton sat at the edge of the bunk, knees pulled close, his voice low. "Sarge, what's gonna happen tomorrow?" Ward did not turn, his voice carrying the cold arrogance he'd worn for years. "They won't dare put me in prison." His words echoed through the cell, like an order from a man who still believed he held control. In the corner, Foster sat folded in on himself, avoiding Ward's eyes every time he moved. There was nothing left of the man who once struggled to hold a place on the team. His gaze drifted across the floor, his arms wrapped tight around his elbows as if he needed to make himself as small as possible. The weight of guilt made it impossible for him to stand upright while listening to Ward talk. To Foster, tomorrow was not just a court date. At the same moment, in Dana Ward's suburban home, the desk was buried in papers, printed emails from various sources, and legal clauses underlined in red ink. The warm lamplight deepened the shadows beneath her eyes. Dana lifted her phone and spoke into it slowly, deliberately. "If you speak in court tomorrow, remember, he is a model officer. I need you to say exactly what we agreed." The line went quiet, then came a single reply. "I can't intervene. This isn't like the previous cases." Dana closed her eyes for 1 second, a strange loneliness sliding down her spine. The woman who had maneuvered through countless hearings now faced a truth she had refused to touch. This time, no one was willing to stand beside her. A breeze slipped through the half-open window, rustling a page at the corner of her desk. Dana set her phone down, her heart heavy as stone. She looked at the framed photo of Lucas taken at an awards ceremony 2 years earlier, standing in the center of his team with a confident smile. She placed her hand on the glass, and for the first time in years, allowed the thought that she might not be able to save her son. Night stretched on, and at the hotel where the DOJ arranged temporary lodging for Avery, she stood by the wide window overlooking the city. The golden glow reflected across her face, capturing a mixture of resolve and unease. Traffic below streamed like a faint ribbon of light. Avery rested her hand on the window frame, her gaze deepening. "Tomorrow," she murmured, as if anchoring herself. "It has to end." She did not say, "It will be fine," nor, "Everything will come to light." She knew justice was not a convenient light switch, and tomorrow's court hearing could open something bigger than Maple Ridge itself. The truth might collapse that pack, but it could also ignite consequences far beyond this town. In the DOJ conference room, Hale reviewed the files one last time. The projector's glow lit his eyes, tired from too many sleepless nights. He flipped each page, checking signatures, confirmations, witness statements, and legal grounds. Every sheet was a vertebra of this case, and he knew that if any one piece was weak, Dana Ward would find it. When the wall clock struck midnight, a DOJ staffer hit "Send" on the laptop, uploading the completed case file to the federal system, marking it ready for court. The chief investigator exhaled, as if setting down a massive stone. "It's done," he said. "Tomorrow is the drop point." Avery returned to her small room, sat on the bed, and checked her phone. Messages from the investigation team blinked. Filed. Evidence solid. Tomorrow will be intense. She read each one, then set the phone aside. She needed her mind clear, free of speculation, free of the storm waiting for dawn. But as she reached to turn off the screen, it lit up again, not with an internal DOJ message, but an automatic update from the court scheduling system tied to the case file. A short line appeared, making Avery sit upright. The hearing had been moved to the largest courtroom. Public pressure had surged. The morning of the federal trial opened with a long line of people waiting in the hallway. Public pressure had forced the hearing to move from the small courtroom to the largest one, where the high ceiling lights shone directly onto the defendant's area. When court officers escorted Ward inside, murmurs rose like a small cloud drifting across the seating rows. The orange uniform made him look slightly diminished, but his eyes still carried the same cold sharpness that once silenced all of Maple Ridge when he walked across the yard. Ward walked straight ahead, shoulders unlowered, steps steady. He scanned the courtroom as if this were not a criminal hearing, but a meeting he believed he still had the authority to command. A flash of confidence crossed his lips, the confidence of someone accustomed to power and to a pack standing behind him. But today, he stood alone. The prosecutor stepped to the podium, opening with a voice clear and controlled down to each breath. Defendant Lucas Ward is charged with 3 counts: intentional bodily harm against a federal agent in the line of duty, attempted homicide, and abuse of authority within a law enforcement environment. The words resonated as something long anticipated, though the recording devices still trembled faintly from the density of the sound. Ward lifted his chin, keeping his gaze challenging. But when the prosecutor played the audio clip filtered by the DOJ, the entire courtroom turned toward the screen. Amid the chaos, the sound of bodies hitting mats and heavy breathing, his voice emerged distorted, but unmistakably precise. "Kill her!" No one spoke for 4 full seconds. Every eye landed on Ward, and he clenched his jaw so tightly a muscle twitched near his cheekbone. A few attendees exhaled sharply, and Dana, seated in the back, froze her fingers, whitening around the strap of her handbag. Ward shot up, growling, "This recording is fabricated. It's been edited?" The prosecutor answered instantly, without missing a beat. Foster's testimony, the door log, and the hallway camera confirmed the opposite. No one could have recreated the exact moment the dojo door was locked from the inside, and the statements of the other officers do not match. Of the round, Dalton lowered his head the moment the door log was mentioned. He didn't dare look at Ward, though he had once viewed him as a guide. Rowe stared down at the table, his hands clasped tightly, fingernails digging into his skin to suppress the tension. They were no longer laughing, no longer the men who believed they stood behind an untouchable leader. Foster was called to the stand. The overhead lights washed his face even paler, sweat breaking despite the cold air in the room. "Mr. Long, Mr. Foster," the prosecutor said. "Did you hear that sentence during the training session?" Foster swallowed, then answered, voice trembling but clear. "Yes, I heard it." "And what did you do when you heard it?" I stood there." Foster closed his eyes for a second, as though each word was a blade slicing toward himself. "I was afraid of Ward, afraid of disobeying. But I knew it was wrong." Ward shot up again. "You're lying!" But the judge struck the gavel, calling for order. And the freezing stare he gave Ward forced him back into his seat. Avery sat in the witness aisle, fingers interlaced, maintaining a level of clarity she had fought hard to keep through the long days of investigation. As Foster spoke, she did not look at him with resentment, but with the acknowledgement that finally, someone from the pack had chosen to step out of the dark. Foster glanced toward Avery briefly, then turned away quickly, unable to face the woman he had nearly become an accomplice in killing. Dana stood near the back of the courtroom. She tried to maintain composure, but every line of her face betrayed the tremor underneath. When her eyes met her son's through the small separation window, she saw what she had long suspected, yet denied. It was not someone else's fault. Not a situation. Not because an outsider provoked him. It was brutally surfacing, with no covering left to hide it. The prosecutor finished with the final sequence of arguments, placing on the table a copy of the audio, the door log, and the aligned testimonies. All evidence establishes that defendant Lucas Ward, in his capacity as a mid-ranking officer, intentionally created a deadly environment for federal agent Avery Cole. This constitutes a severe federal offense. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to speak. Each second stretched like an extra heartbeat. The judge read the verdict slowly, clearly, the weight of each word lingering in the air. Defendant Lucas Ward. Based on the evidence and corroborating testimony, this court sentences you to 32 years in federal prison. No parole, no reinstatement. All ranks and privileges revoked. A wave of noise rippled through the room, a mixture of breath released and disbelief. Dalton collapsed into his seat. Rowe covered his face with both hands, and Foster bowed his head. Dana raised a hand to her mouth to stop the sharp breath escaping. And Ward, he did not blink. Only a faint twitch crossed his jaw before he turned, very slowly, toward Avery. Avery felt the stare before he fully turned his head. A chill ran down her spine, though she sat as straight as ever. Court officers cuffed him and pulled him to his feet. And as he passed the witness aisle, Ward tilted his head just enough for his final words to slip into her ear like a thin, cutting blade. "You'll pay." The next morning, the DOJ released a suspension list so long it plunged the Maple Ridge conference room into a heavy silence. 18 officers, including 3 commanding ranks, were temporarily relieved of all duties to undergo a full investigation. The list was sent directly to the media within 7 minutes, and like a lit fuse, the news spread across the city. Citizens who once placed their trust in Maple Ridge suddenly found themselves staring at a mask falling off. Havers was called into the investigation room first thing. He sat before the wooden table, fingers interlocked so tightly the knuckles turned white. The investigator looked straight at him. Voice steady. "Did you know? Or did you not know?" Havers opened his mouth, but the words snagged in his throat. Finally, he exhaled, as though releasing a burden carried for years. "I was scared of him. More scared of Ward than of reprimand." The statement made everyone in the room exchange glances, realizing the prolonged silence in Maple Ridge was no accident. It was the product of fear trickling from the top down. When the tech division restored old system logs, altered reports surfaced like cuts across still water. Not one, record dozens. Kicks recorded as slips. Violent collisions rewritten as high-intensity training. Internal complaints were erased the same day they were filed. Each falsified entry was another hammer blow to a reputation the department once proudly flaunted across the state. Outside the police department, people gathered in numbers never seen before. They held signs, shouting the slogan, "Justice for the victims of Maple Ridge." Some faces burned with anger. Others stood in silence, as if counting every story they'd once heard, but never dared believe. Reporters crowded the entrance, forming a barricade of camera lenses that forced every officer exiting the building to lower their heads. The chief was summoned into a private disciplinary hearing. When he stepped out 30 minutes later, his face had drained of color, the wrinkles deeper than his age. A DOJ investigator handed him the dismissal order, saying simply, "You let the beast roam free for too long." The chief did not argue, he merely nodded once, slowly, and walked away in complete silence. Meanwhile, Dalton and Rowe sat in the suspension holding area, staring blankly as investigators passed by. Both had cooperated after Foster's testimony, so their charges would be lighter. But the permanent termination notice still sat in the folders before them. Rowe crumpled his paper until it wrinkled, while Dalton let out a small laugh, not of amusement, but the realization that everything they believed would last forever had collapsed within days. Foster was escorted out the back exit of the DOJ, where 2 witness protection officers waited. As he stepped into the vehicle, he glanced up at the gray sky. Eyes reddened yet lighter than they had been in the many days he lived under silent oppression. "It's lighter. Finally," he murmured. He might start a new life somewhere no one knew his past. But today, he had shed the heaviest weight on his shoulders. The DOJ announced Maple Ridge would enter a period of special oversight. For 6 months, every activity, every decision, every training session had to be reported directly to the federal level. A permanent monitoring team was assigned to ensure no more internal adjustments would be buried. Officers still in the department walked through the halls with caution, unlike anything before. The noisy laughter that once filled the building had vanished completely. Avery stood by the glass window on the 2nd floor, looking down at the protest crowd and rows of media vehicles. The pain reflected her face, paler after weeks of confronting the Maple Ridge pack. Hale stepped beside her, arms crossed, silent for a moment as though weighing a thought. His eyes were not on the street, but on the closed office doors behind them, where investigators were finishing the last tasks of the day. Avery asked, voice low but steady. So most of it is done? Hale shook his head. One part is done, but not all of it. She tilted her head, waiting. Hale pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and placed it on the railing. It was the updated list of individuals flagged in the internal cleansing process, 18 names marked in red, 3 crossed out after admitting violations. Avery scanned the list and immediately noticed a missing name. Hale nodded slightly, confirming her thought. There's one person left who hasn't been dealt with, he said, his voice dropping half a tone as if to let the sentence sink into the thick air. Avery did not ask who. The missing name belonged to someone whose influence reached deeper than Ward's, someone connected to layers far below the usual federal structure. Hale placed a hand on Avery's shoulder, his gaze steady, as though preparing for a new battlefield. And she won't fall as easily as the rest of them. The morning at FBI headquarters fell into an unusual stillness, as if the entire building sensed that something heavy was about to be brought into the light. In the gray stone hallway, Dana Ward's footsteps echoed evenly yet slowly, as though each step carried the weight of a mother and an attorney being pushed toward her final limit. Her long coat swayed lightly behind her, but her eyes bore the faint trace of defeat she tried to hide beneath her familiar layer of pride. She stopped before the mahogany door, leading into the disciplinary room. The overhead light reflected off the strands of gray in her hair, making her face appear even more hollow. 2 security officers standing guard bowed their heads, and Dana returned the gesture softly, as if she no longer had the strength to project tension onto anyone. A minute later, the door opened, and she stepped inside, back straight and chin slightly raised, the posture of someone accustomed to standing before legal battles, except this battle was against the very system she had once served. The disciplinary board consisted of 3 people, all of whom looked at her with a neutral but not cold demeanor. The head of the board, a gray-haired man who had served 3 decades in the FBI, reviewed the file once before speaking. Attorney Dana Ward, he said, voice steady as though reading words carved in stone. You are summoned for suspicion of unlawful interference in a federal investigation, specifically concerning the case involving your son. Dana set her bag down on the chair, her hand trembling slightly, though her gaze maintained its usual sharpness. I did not interfere with the core of the case, she said. I only wanted to ensure Lucas's legal rights were protected. The chairman furrowed his brow. You made 12 phone calls to 3 individuals directly involved in processing the case. You attended 2 off-schedule meetings. You exerted soft pressure on an investigator. He lifted his eyes. All because the defendant is your son. The room seemed to contract. Dana drew a breath, her hand clenching until the knuckles whitened. I am a mother before I am an attorney, she said, her voice breaking at the word mother, like a string stretched so tightly it could no longer hold. She had never exposed vulnerability in any courtroom. Yet today was no trial. It was a verdict on her humanity. The chairman tilted his head, his eyes free of judgment but firm. And for that reason, you were placed into a severe conflict of interest position. We cannot overlook this. Insta 7. Another board member opened a second file, voice cooler. Mrs. Ward, the disciplinary committee has concluded. Suspension from your position for 1 year. Special oversight for 2 additional years. Revocation of access to sensitive files until re-evaluation. Dana did not react immediately. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to absorb the full weight of the ruling. When she opened them again, a mixture of hurt, anger, and a frightening hollowness glimmered within. She rose slowly, retrieved her handbag, bowed her head with bare minimum courtesy, and walked out. The door shut behind her with a metallic finality. It was not the sound of a meeting ending, it was the sound of a chapter she once believed untouchable, slamming shut. The hallway remained frozen as she walked, her heels striking the floor in echoes so long one could imagine they were counting the years she would now pay back. Turning down the left corridor, Dana stopped when she saw Avery standing by the window. Morning light reflected across Avery's face, giving it a calm, bright composure filled with life, a stark contrast to the exhausted face of a mother who had just received her sentence. They looked at each other for several seconds, and the silence between them held something unnameable. Dana spoke first. "Are you satisfied now?" Her voice no longer sharp as a blade. It sagged with the exhaustion of someone who had fought too long for something that should never have been fought for. Avery looked at her, her eyes devoid of hatred and devoid of pity. "But I could not let him kill me." Her words did not ring as justification, but as a truth both women were forced to face. Dana turned her head away, chest lifting sharply with a deep breath. When she faced Avery again, her eyes no longer carried defiance but recognition. "As a mother," she said softly, "sometimes we shield what is wrong without seeing how large it has grown." Her voice was thin as thread, yet each word carried the weight of a revelation made far too late. Avery said nothing. Some truths could not be soothed. The two women stood side by side for a fleeting moment, not as victim and perpetrator's mother, but as two people witnessing the cost society pays for silence. Dana left first, her steps slower than when she arrived, as though she had aged 10 years overnight. Avery watched her go, feeling no triumph. What remained was an undefined hollow, the understanding that justice sometimes punishes not only the guilty, but also those who loved in the wrong way. An hour later, Avery left headquarters to return to the Federal Technical Office to finalize her last report. The parking lot was unusually empty. A light wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves. She slowed when she felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. The vibration was brief, unlike any internal notification she was used to. She pulled the phone out. The black screen lit up, but no app icon appeared. Only a single line of text, floating on the dark background like a message from somewhere far outside the FBI system. "Your test is complete." Avery froze. The wind rushing past her ears seemed to fall silent. Her heart struck once, hard, not from fear, but from recognizing something approaching closer, clearer. Someone had been watching her entire path, and this test had never belonged to Maple Ridge. Avery's apartment lay in the soft amber glow of a desk lamp, the kind of light gentle enough to make these final long days feel slightly less strained. The city outside was slowly settling into quiet, but inside, the air still carried the aftertaste of Maple Ridge, like a thin layer of dust that could not be brushed off in a single night. Avery placed her coat on the chair and sank onto the sofa, her shoulders finally allowed to fall after weeks drawn tight like a bowstring. She closed her eyes for a moment, hoping for a bit of peace. But at that exact second, the phone on the table vibrated. Avery opened her eyes, pausing. No notification from Hale, no report from the DOJ. The screen simply lit up on its own, no application icon in sight, as if the device had suddenly been taken over. She picked up the phone, a cold sensation touching her palm as the display shifted to a completely black background. A long second passed before a silver triangle appeared, rotating slowly like a metallic reflection inside the dark. Avery sat upright. The triangle did not belong to any internal FBI system, nor to any federal entity she recognized. When the symbol reached its midpoint in rotation, the first line appeared beneath it, sharp and cold. "We saw what you did." Avery's pulse struck once, hard. The words felt like someone's breath sliding from behind her, though she knew the apartment was locked. The second line appeared faster. "You didn't break." She tightened her grip on the phone, inhaling slowly. She did not feel threatened. Instead, it felt like a strange acknowledgement, as if someone had watched every moment she stood inside the dojo, every minute she survived while surrounded by the Maple Ridge pack. "Who's sending this?" Avery whispered, though she knew no one on the other end could hear. The screen shifted again. The black background faded like an electronic door sliding open. A world map expanded, each national border lighting up like connected wires. Red points began appearing across it, each pulsing rhythmically like alarm signals. Avery slid her finger across the screen. Every point, when enlarged, revealed a sequence of coordinates, timestamps, and traces of cases never made public. No files, no DOJ data, no indication of press coverage. This was a layer of darkness that even the FBI did not have the reach for. A voice came through the phone's speaker, soft, neither male nor female, as though the tone had been engineered to hide all identity. "If you want to rise, follow the signal." Avery closed her eyes briefly. The voice did not give orders. It invited her into something deeper. One red point on the map began blinking, the light fluctuating as if calling for her attention. Avery opened her eyes and stared at the blinking point. An unfamiliar city, unrelated to Maple Ridge, unconnected to any assignment she had ever been part of. The symbols beneath it described forms of misconduct, living in a gray zone that only an unofficial organization could monitor. A different darkness, a different battle, but this time it was not the FBI sending her. She rose from the sofa and walked to the window. The glowing rectangles of nighttime windows formed a glittering picture she had once thought peaceful. But after Maple Ridge, she understood that peace was often just a mask. Beneath it, someone was always being trampled, erased, or abandoned. And if someone was watching to see who would step toward that hidden darkness, they had chosen her. Avery turned back, placed the phone on the table, and put her coat on. Her movements were unhurried, but resolute. The exhaustion in her body could not keep her seated. The two words the voice had used, "want to rise," were not merely a suggestion. They reminded her that surviving was not the final goal. Surviving was the only condition required to move into places most people feared to tread. The phone vibrated again. This time, not a map or symbol, just a short line of 4 words. Signal updated. "Ready?" Avery looked at the message as though staring at an invisible doorway opening before her. A doorway that carried no federal insignia, no protection, no procedural safety net. A doorway into the world's shadows, the places law could not reach, the places justice had forgotten. Avery inhaled deeply. From the day she joined the FBI, she believed the system could mend its decaying parts if the right people fought hard enough from within. But Maple Ridge had shown her that some rot existed at depths regulations and paperwork could never illuminate. The red points on the map testified to that truth. Someone had built a network capable of seeing where the system was blind, and they were inviting her in. She tapped the screen. At the moment her fingertip touched the triangle symbol, the phone emitted a silver flash, then settled into a silent black screen. Yet a single line remained, sharp as a whisper from the dark. "If you accept, step outside." Avery looked around her apartment. Everything was familiar, but within that familiarity, she realized she no longer belonged to this place. She had not stepped out of Maple Ridge's darkness to return to her old life. She had stepped out to see more clearly where other shadows lived. Avery turned off the light, opened the door, and walked into the hallway. The night wind drifted through a small window at the end, carrying a chill that sharpened her focus. Her phone lit up again in her hand. A silver arrow appeared, pointing a direction, no address, only a dynamic signal that shifted as she moved. As Avery reached the elevator, the screen brightened once more. A final line appeared, clear and cold, yet without threat. It felt like a declaration marking the beginning of something far larger. Project Rise initiation started. The elevator doors slid open. Avery stepped inside without looking back.